This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and this is part 8 of Woe Unto You, Lawyers, by Fred Rodell, from 1939, out of print. Not accidentally so. That last part is my opinion. This is part 8, chapter 9, Incubators of the Law. Quote, "The legal apprentice, he sweats and he strains to memorize every principle. He'd learn a lot more in the end for his pains by studying something sensible." Unquote, Anonymous. As every good fascist knows, the perpetuation of the fascist fraud depends, in the long run, on the training of fledglings in the faith. Oh, we see that all around the place, all around America nowadays. The dictators catch their conscripts young and discipline them to think in goose step. Yeah. Or to drive around in pickup trucks with dual American flags stuck into the camper holes in the back of the pickup. Yeah, I know about that. Promises of reward for the faithful and ominous warnings about the dangers of nonconformity play their part in making apprentices firmly believe a mass of lies, half-lies, and nonsense. Doubt, even the tiniest wondering doubt, is the cardinal sin. There are few heretics. Side note here, I should drink a cup of coffee here. Okay, so this isn't like an audiobook you'd get in the library, because the narrator hardly stops to drink a cup of coffee there. But then again, you'd never hear a book like this. You'd never be able to get a book like this in your public library. So it is very unlike a book you would get in the library, audiobook. What I was going to say, and you don't get narrators stopping to digress about their personal happenings either, but I'm going to do that. My buddy, I mentioned him a few shows back. He gives history lectures. He's an amateur historian. He knows someone at the library. And about twice a year, I guess, he gives a history lecture on a certain topic in the conference room of the local public library. This weekend, I mentioned before, he is giving a talk on FDR's foreign policy. I just ran into him in the grocery store again today, and he's begging me, pleading with me to come to his lecture. And I understand why he wants me to come, and his couple other friends, we guys who are nerds and play these strategy board games, as I said, get together once every month or two. He wants to see a friendly face in the audience, and when you give a lecture to strangers, I know, I'm over that, actually. I used to have a hideous phobia of that hideous, which maybe that's why the Lord had me have that. He wanted me to get over that. So, boy, I'm over that. But my buddy, he wants to see. I understand it. But the problem is, I told him in an email when he asked me, I said, look, 2 reasons why I can't go. Number 1, I no longer believe anything mainstream history tells me, and I've read this, and this book, which tells me the truth about FDR, and nothing from the mainstream tells the truth about FDR. And then I said, besides that, I'm really hoping to have a second job, a job at night by, that's by this weekend. Yeah, because I need to get one. I really need to get one. And Well, and I have been looking, by the way, but it looks like I'm not going to have the luxury of being choosy at all, it looks like. Which means I think I'm going to be working at like 7-Eleven or a gas station. Which, hey, if that's where the Lord wants me to go, fine. But anyway, when I ran into my buddy in the store today, it's like it's like the part of the email that the only part of the email that registered with him was the fact that I might be working at night by then. I might have this other job. It didn't register with him. The other part that I said about the mainstream history being garbage, it went in one ear and out the other. I got complete vacuous eyes from my friend. He really has no concept, no idea that he's in a matrix. It was one of those surreal, creepy moments that we all have from time to time now, if you're listening to the show on a regular basis. Well, it gets a little creepier when it's one of your friends. Anyway, so now I'm thinking I might just go to this thing just to take notes on all the things that are wrong. Maybe I'll make a show out of that later. If I go, we'll see. I'd love to tape him, but I don't want to do that to my buddy. Tape him and put it on. No, I would never do that to somebody, but I might go take notes. But also, though, because I know he's insecure about his lecturing ability, so he's going to ask afterwards, how did I do? And I'm thinking maybe I want to be able to tell him, well, you, as a speaker, did fine, but your information was wrong. Oh, do I need to do that? You know, if people want to suck their thumb, and if people want to stick to baby food history, who am I to break them of it? But it's another thing when somebody is just begging you, come hear my baby food history. Please come hear me give a lecture on baby food history. Oh, man. I know I'm not going to hear about FDR knowing about Pearl Harbor, provoking Pearl Harbor, and deliberately not sending the warning of Japan's declaration of war and all the other messages, not sending it to the commanders at Pearl Harbor so that 3,000 or whatever, 3,000 Americans would be murdered. I know I'm not going to hear that about FDR. I know I'm not going to... Boy, I guess that coffee's taking effect. I just started drinking it, too. I know I'm not going to hear about Churchill and FDR both working in cahoots to bring America into the war. And they both knew what Japan was going to do. I know I'm not going to hear about how exactly the same FDR's New Deal and Hitler's New Order was. They were the same because they were financed by the same Wall Street bankers. I know I'm not going to hear about any of that. No, I'm not going to hear about any of that. I'm not going to hear about how FDR was murdered. He didn't die. Didn't die of natural causes. He served his fascist communist purposes, socialized the country, took away the gold. I'm not going to hear about FDR acting as a highwayman, a brigand, and fleecing, robbing foolish Americans of their gold, and in 1933 declaring all American citizens enemies of the state. All of which FDR did, and more, much, much more. I'm going to hear the Hitler Channel, the History Channel version, the whitewashed version of history. And this, my friend has read book after book about FDR, but it's all garbage. It's all watered down, whitewashed, Barnes & Noble history book garbage. So, should I go and take notes on it this Saturday? I don't know. It'll give me something to do. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know what I'm going to do right now. But I went and might have to run into him today. Begging me to go. Just begging me. Okay. Back to Fred Rodell's book, Woe Unto You Lawyers. The law cannot catch its communicants, so young. But the same mental goose step and the same kind of hopes and fears are used, perhaps not so purposefully, but just as efficaciously, to instill a fighting belief in the nonsense of the law. And of course, it is on the rigid training of apprentices in the art that the perpetuation of the legal legend depends. There was a time when the law, like other more substantial and more useful trades, was learned in the shop of a full-blown practitioner. An aspiring lawyer studied his precepts and his principles while serving a term as office assistant to some member of the bar. Today, the members of the bar must usually pay for their assistance with something more than a lot of legal language dressed up as words of wisdom. The trade has acquired academic pretensions, and those citadels of logical legerdemain, known as law schools, are now the incubators of the law. Consequently, the hope of the law, that is, the hope of the lawyers that their game will go on indefinitely, undiminished, and undisputed, lies with the law schools. And conversely, the one slim hope that the big balloon of inflated nonsense may ever be exploded by internal combustion lies with the law schools too. Once the professional gibberish jugglers have proceeded beyond the training stage, it is almost always too late. They have to be caught young in the law to be turned into disciples or heretics. In order to teach apprentices how to talk the language and how to reason in the proper abstract circles, the law schools have divided the law's mass of principles into big chunks. Each chunk represents a quote-unquote field of law and is taught in a separate course or courses. There are contracts and torts and trusts. There are constitutional law and criminal law and labor law. There are fields and courses by the score. Of course, an actual case may fall into several fields at the same time. It may involve, for instance, the Constitution and a crime and a labor dispute. But that will not faze the law schools. So far as they are concerned, it is the principles, not the cases, that really matter. And so the same case will show up in constitutional law and in criminal law and in labor law. It will not, however, show up in the same way. In constitutional law, the relevant principles of constitutional law will be examined. In criminal law, the relative principles of criminal law will be examined. In labor law, the relative principles of labor law will be examined. In each one of the courses, the aspects of the case that fall into the other two course categories will be either glossed over or omitted entirely. A student may thus have to take 3 courses in order to understand thoroughly, even from the legal standpoint, what one decision is all about, but not in order to learn any one quote-unquote field of law. Thus, law school courses, since they are cut out of the pseudo-science of law, inevitably focus on generalities and abstractions rather than on the solution of specific problems. A student might even study a case in a dozen different courses and thus learn all about the law of the case and still not have the slightest comprehension of, or insight into, the real down-to-earth factual difficulty or controversy that brought the case into court. Sometimes a quote-unquote field of law is too big to be stuffed into one course. For example, property law is commonly divided into real property and personal property, parenthesis. Neither real nor personal, of course, means what it means in everyday conversation, end parentheses. And wills and mortgages and negotiable instruments and several more. But then property law is, for the most part, only a big branch of contract law. Moreover, corporation law, a field extensive enough to have various subdivisions of its own, is in essence nothing but a branch of property law. It is almost as hard to keep straight the hierarchy of legal fields and courses as it is to sort out the abstract principles of which the different courses are constructed. And either process is like trying to cut water with a knife. One of the biggest and strangest fields of legal learning is something known as pleading and procedure. The law schools divide pleading and procedure into many courses, and some of these courses, like evidence, are rated as fields unto themselves. But the strange thing about pleading and procedure is not its size. Property law is at least as big and as full of principles. The strange thing is that the lawyers and the law schools do not even pretend to themselves that the principles and rules of pleading and procedure have anything to do with the solution of practical problems. Pleading and procedure is, admittedly, just a lot of verbal complications and technicalities that lawyers have to memorize, or know where to look up, before they can practice their trade. And that admission is, of course, unique in the law. As a matter of fact, the lawyers and the law schools lump the whole remainder of the law together. Contracts and criminal law and torts and trusts and the rest of the card catalog of abstract principles, and call it all, quote, substantive law, unquote, as opposed to the, quote-unquote, adjective or, quote-unquote, procedural law of pleading and procedure courses. The term substantive law is supposed to imply that the principles of contracts and torts and the rest really cope with the substance of human or social problems. But even the lawyers can't make such a claim for pleading and procedure. Pleading and procedure covers all the principles and rules of law which govern the way lawyers may make use of other principles and rules of law. If that sounds complicated, so is pleading and procedure. For P&P encompasses the code of precepts according to which the legal game is played, once a dispute actually starts on its way to court. And when you begin dealing with a lot of abstract principles about the proper manipulation of other abstract principles, you can't help getting somewhat confused. Don't suppose, either, that the principles and rules of pleading and procedure are, for the most part, any more precise or any less ambiguous than other principles of law. A bit of evidence at a trial does not fall into the famous, quote, irrelevant, incompetent, and immaterial, unquote, classification any more automatically than a killing falls into, quote, second-degree murder, unquote. A legal dispute does not involve, quote, two separate causes of action, unquote, which only means that it will probably have to be tried in two separate lawsuits, any more readily or scientifically than a piece of paper with writing on it involves an, quote, executory contract, unquote. The principles of pleading and procedure are just as slippery when you try to apply them to the facts of trying a lawsuit as are other legal principles when you try to apply them to the facts that lie behind a lawsuit. Moreover, even though the P&P principles admittedly contribute nothing at all to the actual solution of the problems that the law is called on to solve, the decision as on a substantive principle. All too often, not only justice, but also the regular principles of substantive law are thrown out the window simply because some lawyer, in handling his client's case, has forgotten or violated a quote-unquote procedural rule. Thus, a killing may be, without so much as a legal doubt, a punishable murder, and still the murderer may go free, for a time, or even for good, just because a bit of evidence used in the trial is labeled, quote, irrelevant, incompetent, and immaterial, unquote. A man with a legal claim so clear and valid that neither a lawyer nor a non-lawyer would question his right to have that claim satisfied may get nothing out of it except a bill for counsel fee, simply because his lawyer, at some stage of the case, has been caught using the wrong words according to the principles of pleading and procedure. Perhaps all this discussion of the pleading and procedure quote-unquote field may seem irrelevant, incompetent, and immaterial to the question of how the law schools go about producing consecrated devotees of the law. Yet there is this to remember. The lawyers and the law schools admit that pleading and procedure, or practice, as this alliterative field is sometimes called, deals exclusively with the tricks of the trade. The legal neophytes are told that what they learn under the heading P&P constitutes the technique of the lawyer's art. As a dentist learns how to handle his drill, so a lawyer learns his pleading and procedure. By contrast, the rest of the law, the quote-unquote substantive principles of property and quasi-contracts, oh yes, there is that too, and corporations and all, are pounded into the young legal brain as ultimate truths about life. Even after the apprentice graduates from law school, when he comes to take his bar examination, he will find the distinction carefully preserved. One part of his ordeal will test his knowledge of quote-unquote substantive law. The other part will test his knowledge of pleading and procedure. One represents wisdom, The other represents skill. What the law's apprentices rarely learn and are rarely given half a chance to find out is that the whole of the law is nothing but a technique to be mastered and adroitness to be achieved. That technique, reduced to its simplest terms, is the technique of using a new language. That is all the law student learns in his courses on pleading and procedure. That is also all the law student learns in his courses in quote-unquote substantive law. But because the former are frankly labeled technique and the latter are labeled truth, the student comes to believe implicitly that there is a gaping difference in kind, where actually there is scarcely so much as a difference in degree. Quote, "The original burden of proof is on the plaintiff," unquote, is a principle of pleading and procedure and may help a lawyer win a lawsuit. Quote, "If the defendant's action was not the proximate cause of the injury, then the defendant is not legally responsible," unquote, is a principle of torts and may help a lawyer win a lawsuit. All that a student ever learns about either of these principles, or about any other principle of either division of law, is how to say them and when and where it may be useful to say them. The point is that the law schools, by admitting that one segment of legal education deals with the devices of the trade, make quite plausible the fable that the rest of the law represents something much more solid. With the procedural courses frankly set to one side as technique, the big empty words and the vague abstract principles of the other courses assume a more credible aura of depth and reality to the newcomer. He can, and does, then believe that the words have meaning, and that the principles are nuggets of wisdom, and it is essential to the perpetuation of the legal legend that he should believe this. For it would be fatal to the profession, to its self-respect and its solemnity and its power, if any generation of rising lawyers were allowed or encouraged to discover the real truth about the stuff they study, which is that all the legal principles they ever learn amount to no more than tricks of the trade, and that all the courses they ever take are courses in pleading and procedure. And so the law schools stick to their principles, and to the pretense that the principles stand for eternal verities, which lawyers, after learning how to do it, graciously apply to the hurly-burly of man's earthly affairs. The principles, as a matter of fact, used to be dished at the students without so much as any trimmings around them. That was when law schools were an innovation, scorned by most lawyers as an effete and none too efficient preparation for the practice of law, just as schools of journalism are scorned by most newspaper men today. That's interesting. I'll bet schools of journalism are no longer even scorned today either. Now that all journalists just go to the AP wire, or whatever the UPI AP wire. The choke points of media reporting control. Back to the book. In those days, and for some time after, law students learned practically nothing but naked principles. The principles of each field of law were sorted out and arranged by sub-principles and counter-principles in a quote-unquote horn book of torts or trusts or whatever. The students studied their horn books, listened to lectures devoted mainly to explaining and quote-unquote reconciling the principles, so that they appeared to fit into one neat little ball of abstract knowledge, and religiously memorized the principles. They might never so much as read the record of a single lawsuit. Why should they clutter their minds with disconcerting and trivial facts when they were engaged in learning great and general truths? But late in the last century, a reputed revolution in the manner of teaching law began to take the law schools by storm. The new idea was to feed the student the opinions written by judges in actual cases and let them fish for principles among the judges' words. Obviously, it was not the intention of this new approach to legal education to minimize the importance of principles as such. The purpose was to let the students ponder how the law in action made use of its principles for judicial opinions in terms of the principles that, quote-unquote, controlled. The students still had to learn their principles, but they had to find them first. Of course, the students did not have to fish in the dark. In each field of law, a big bunch of opinions was gathered together by some recognized authority in that branch of legal learning, and was then arranged according to the principles illustrated by the opinions in a quote-unquote casebook. The students then read the right cases in the right order, and the principles practically popped out at them from the pages. It's like a multiple choice quiz. The facts behind any case did not really matter and were often omitted entirely from the reprint of the judge's opinion, as were the parts of the opinion that dealt with other fields of law. What was important still was to learn the deathless principles, enhanced a bit in impressiveness by the fact that they were now taken right out of the judges' mouths. The quote-unquote casebook method of teaching law is still the vogue in the law schools. Fledgling lawyers are no longer encouraged to take their principles straight. In order to learn that acceptance of an offer is essential to the validity of a contract, they must plow through half a dozen verbose judicial outpourings, which say just that in 1,000 times the space. In order to learn that it is unconstitutional for a state to attempt to tax property outside its quote-unquote jurisdiction, they must worry through 5 or 10 judicial gems like Senior versus Braden. But when they have finished, they will usually have learned no more than that acceptance of an offer is essential to the validity of a contract, or that it is unconstitutional for a state to attempt to tax property outside its quote-unquote jurisdiction. In many ways, the old-fashioned hornbook method of legal education made more sense. It was more direct and more straightforward, and you could learn more principles faster. Law students today pay tribute to it when, after taking a course from a casebook, they study for their examination in the course from a hornbook. Moreover, it is an interesting commentary on the most quote-unquote advanced law schools, which have carried the casebook method to such extremes that the principles do not always come quite clear to the students, that their graduates invariably have to take special quote-unquote cram courses in the bare principles of law in order to pass their bar examinations and be admitted to membership in the legal fraternity. As a matter of fact, these quote-unquote advanced law schools, and there are only a handful of them, with their extreme use of the case method of teaching, deserve a special word. Despite the fact that they do not teach their students the law any too well, they do teach something else. In so doing, they are traitors to the legal legend and a potential threat to the perpetuation of the racket of the law. For they actually encourage their students to dig out of the cases a little more than abstract legal principles. The bald human facts that bring any dispute into court are rated as worth consideration, not merely as an excuse for the application of the law, but in their own right. These few law schools still divide legal education into courses based on different quote-unquote fields of law, but the courses and the quote-unquote fields are more likely to be cut out according to types of practical problems, government control of business or corporate management, instead of according to tables of abstract principles. More significantly, though, regardless of course names, the courses themselves, or most of them, for even the most advanced law schools cannot entirely avoid law-consecrated teachers. They are taught with a different emphasis. That emphasis is on the non-legal aspects of earthly affairs and problems which the facts of any lawsuit bring to light. Students are trained not to discard these matters as irrelevant, but rather to concentrate on them, to think about fair and reasonable solutions that might be applied to various kinds of problems, still from the practical standpoint. If, for instance, a milk company goes to law to protest against a state statute setting the price of milk, the past profits, or lack of profits, of the milk distributors, the medical need of milk for slum children, the present financial shape of dairy farmers, the personnel and ability of the government agency doing the price setting, all may be treated as just as important as the, quote, due process clause, unquote, of the 14th Amendment, the, quote-unquote, police power of the state in question, or the, quote-unquote, affectation or non-affectation of the milk industry with a, quote-unquote, public interest. If a widow sues a railroad company because her husband was killed at a grade crossing, the annual toll of grade crossing fatalities and cost of eliminating such crossings altogether, and the well-known weakness of both judges and juries when confronted with weeping widows, may all come into the discussion along with the doctrines of, quote, contributory negligence, unquote, quote, proximate cause, unquote, and, quote, the last clear chance, unquote. Not that the principles of law are altogether neglected in these quote-unquote advanced law school courses. The students inevitably still read and memorize and try to quote-unquote reconcile the same old concepts and abstractions. But the tough meat of factual problems is mixed into their educational diet. The cases become more than settings for the sanctification of legal principles. Now the results of this kind of teaching are strange and varied. In the first place, the fledgling lawyers do not learn their principles nearly so well as their predecessors used to learn them by the hornbook method, nor as their contemporaries learned them by the regular casebook method. The intrusion of factual issues and of other considerations which touch the law only remotely make the principles harder to concentrate on and harder to remember. That is why they have to take cram courses after they graduate from law school in order to pass their bar examinations. The bar examinations and the cram courses deal almost exclusively with the law. Moreover, the attempt to tie together the real problems that lie behind all law cases and the abstract principles on which decisions in law cases are said to be based usually results in one of two things. For the less intellectually sturdy students, the results will be utter confusion. They will neither understand the problems nor learn the principles. But for the brighter boys, the result will likely be a realization that the problems and the principles have very little in common. From that realization, it is but a short step to a sort of unformulated contempt for the law and its principles. And if legal neophytes should ever begin to realize in mass that legal principles are largely constructed of long words and irrelevant abstractions, it would be the beginning of the end of the legal legend. That is the way, and the only way, that the inflated mass of hokum known as the law might ever be exploded from the inside. But it is a possibility so remote that it is ridiculous to contemplate. For the vast majority of legal apprentices in the vast majority of law schools still go blissfully on pulling principles out of judges' opinion, being taught in mental goose-step the sacred language of concepts and precepts, to emerge as doughty and undoubting defenders of the legal tradition, and perhaps to become, eventually, Wall Street law partners or Supreme Court justices. Those comparatively few students of those comparatively few law schools who do learn to recognize the great gap between worldly problems and legal principles, and who do not ever fall prey to the propaganda of the trade they are practicing and forget all they once knew, these can become extremely useful citizens. They have been trained to look at every legal problem as what it really is, a practical problem in the adjustment of men's affairs. They have been taught to throw aside the entangling trappings of legal language in seeking a fair and reasonable and workable solution. And then, having found such a solution, how to wrap it up again in respectable legal clothes and work for it in terms of principles of law. In short, they have learned how to treat the whole of the law as a technique, as a means to an end, as pleading and procedure. And more than that, they have learned something woefully rare among the modern medicine men. They have learned to concentrate on the end, which is the practical solution of a human problem, instead of on the means, which is the law. Nor is it merely a question of being able to phrase a desired result of legal language and to support it with accepted legal principles. That, because of the nature of legal principles, is a pushover. Every lawyer can do that. Every lawyer does that every time he handles a case, although he may not always be aware that he is using a tool rather than fighting for the right in the realm of ultimate truth. It is instead a question of going at the solution of human problems in an intelligent and practical and socially useful way, and then, and only then, reverting to the medium of the law. It is a question of applying to any set of facts a combination of common sense and technical information and quote-unquote justice, undiluted by ambiguous principles, and letting the law fall where it may. Yet, one bothersome query remains about the rare law school products who have learned how to do this. Why should their minds and their courses and their subsequent work be constantly encumbered with a lot of fool principles? Why, after all, should they have had to learn the law too? Okay, folks, that was Chapter 9, and it was Part 8, of Woe Unto You Lawyers by Fred Rodell from 1939. You're probably not supposed to know what's in here, and that's probably why it's out of print. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth.